All right. Okay, we are recording. So we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. This current session is on maintaining an inclusive classroom environment. And so we just finished a session on designing an inclusive course. And so if you were not able to attend that, and you kind of want to know how to structure your course, right from the beginning to make it an inclusive course, we invite you to check out that recording, which should be up later today. So, all right. So beyond the first day of class, a couple of things we can do to continue in creating this welcoming environment to students is arriving early and staying late. This is to allow students to ask questions and to, be able to rely on, that kind of consistency of your availability. And we're not talking, a half an hour on either end of your class, just a few minutes just to, ask them how they're doing and allow them to ask any questions or even set up. I do this a lot. If the conversation is longer than just a couple of minutes, we sit down, we look at our calendars and we set up a meeting that works for all of us, particularly if it's unable to, accommodate the office hours that we have set.
And it's just a nice way of chatting with students informally, letting them feel more comfortable with you, because students are much more likely to chat with you either right before class or right at the end. So if you can fit that into your schedule, allow a little bit of time for those informal communications.
Also thinking about inclusive office hours. So when we say this, we're thinking about, particularly about the language that you're using describing office hours. It's not always clear to students what office hours means. For us, we understand that they are student hours for students to come and ask questions, but sometimes students interpret office hours as time that the professor is taking for themselves to work on their own work. And so, thinking about changing up some of that language to maybe student hours or student, help hours, and can go a long way for students, particularly our first gen students who may not have that sort of generational knowledge of how universities and professors structure their time. Other things you want to think about are considering times that accommodate students.
So yeah, but going back to the office hours, using things like student hours could be helpful. Something that came up in one of our discussions during the reading group this morning, though, was some people use the term happy hour or something similar, or something that is a little more positive, just to or welcome students a little bit more for those times.
And I often, with my office hours, I'll often take my office hours at the cafe here in the library. And what I do, because I also am one of those professors that I'm like, why aren't they coming to my office hours, right? I send them an email like 30 minutes before that says, I'm going to be in the Lake Effect Cafe from this time till this time. Please stop in if you have any questions. Every single time I get infinitely more students who swing by during that time period, or I actually get a response that's like, I can't make it during that time. Is there some other time that will work for you that we can meet? If I just throw kind of passively my office hours on my syllabus, nobody shows up. That's just, simply that's what happens. And so, to think about, different locations that might, accommodate their schedules a little bit more, especially, if you've got students taking a lot of classes in Shinneman, but my office is in Mahar, I do offer virtual office hours, but, for them to be able to find a empty space where they can get onto Zoom is, not always the easiest as well. So to think about, different locations, considering times that accommodate students. So, often student, undergraduate classes during the day end around 4 o'clock. And so having office hours, after those times, if it accommodates your schedule, might be helpful for some students. So if you hold office hours at 7 to 9 a.m., you're probably going to limit the number of students who are able to access you for that support. So think about having varied times on different days, different hours throughout each of those days if it works for your schedule.
And use Zoom too,
Yeah,
you know,
use
allow
Zoom
students
and-
to either show up in person or remotely.
So what do you think of non-traditional students? Sometimes the messaging that works really well for traditional students who, as you said, maybe in another building
Sure.
or walking around campus already, so drop in.
Yeah,
I mean, the cafe, that works great.
Yeah.
But I get that message. I'm a working individual. Now you're telling me I
Yeah.
should somehow, since I have a problem, now come to the
come to
library.
the library or
So
something, yeah.
the way they take that becomes really critical.
Sure. And for my remote instruction, I would send out like in a similar way, a half hour before I'd send out my Zoom link that says I'm going to be, on Zoom remotely from this time to this time. You can just drop in. I'll, enable the waiting room function so that, people aren't dropping in on each other's, meetings and so forth. But, again, kind of, for a non-traditional student, also thinking about expanding those times to outside of a working day can be really helpful.
My summer class, all my office hours are in the evening or weekend.
Yeah. So to think about that. So another thing you can, I'll let John talk about this because I think he probably has more background on this point, but to make use of transition. So, having your class time, when you're shifting from topic to topic, kind of having, a moment for students to kind of collect their thoughts and, think about the material ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things. You can also do something right at the start of class as people are walking in, especially if you have a larger class. It's really helpful to have something to focus attention. I've often in the past used some song, have a music playing or a music video playing, and then once class starts, ask them how it relates to what we're going to be talking about that day, because they know what reading they were supposed to do in advance. And just that sort of pre-testing activates prior knowledge. It makes them think a little bit about how this might connect, and that makes them a little bit more open for learning. And, one of the things I've often done is I've had questions embedded in the class using polling software, where I will have them watch a short video clip, often just a minute or two, and ask them how that is an example of something that they just discussed in class, or what economic theory predicts would happen. And then, we have them, they answer the question individually, then I get the results back. I have them talk it over amongst themselves, and then poll them again, and then we discuss it. And those breaks in the discussion bring students right back to focus, because it's easy for students' attention to fade, as is true for us too in long meetings. So breaking things up and doing these types of changes or transitions can help students regain focus and can help let you know what they're understanding, and also give them some feedback on how they're understanding the content. If you could, yeah, my side.
All right, so another thing you can do is to really rely on peer activities, right? Allow time for and encourage students to introduce themselves before engaging in collaborative tasks. I do this a lot with any kind of small group discussion, and I, tell them, I'm like, I know this is going to get tired, but at, some point I really want you guys to have each other's names memorized. And so, at the beginning of every discussion group, I ask them to go around, introduce each other, tell them, one or two things interesting about each other. Sometimes I have them play two truths and a lie, and, to, really get to know each other, kind of break down that discussion, sort of anxiety barrier, and, really build that sense of community among our students.
And using the tilt approach, the transparency in learning and teaching, is really helpful. Introduce the learning objectives in each course module at the start of the class and so forth, and let students know exactly what you're going to be focusing on, what goals you want them to be able to achieve, what skills you want them to achieve in each day of the course, or each unit of the course or module if you have an asynchronous course on each day, and also let them know what the activity is supposed to help them do, and make clear how those tasks relate to what you want them to know. And if you find that your assignments don't really connect to your learning objectives, then either those are not the appropriate learning objectives or those are not the appropriate assignments. So make sure that what you're doing is tightly related to what skills you want the students to achieve, and be transparent about that. Let them know why you're doing things, that it's not busy work, that there's a purpose behind it, and it's important for the skills development. And that type of approach does quite a bit to reduce some of the equity gaps that we observe.
And again, to be consistent about it. So, not just talking about your learning objectives on that first day, of course, but, really showing it throughout every unit, every module, every day, every activity, every assignment, really keeps that kind of continuity of, purpose and goals for these activities.
And things that are obvious to us will not be obvious to students. So making explicit some of those connections really helps them understand why these things are important, and also helps them form those connections that we already have, which is why we know these things are important, but students haven't gotten there yet. And it's important to help them make those connections.
So also using clear and transparent instructions and assessments. So, thinking about when you are grading and assessing students' learning, that you're providing rubrics or checklists to students before they complete that assignment, so that they know exactly what's expected of them. They know what exemplary work looks like versus unsatisfactory work, and so forth. Providing examples of what mastery looks like. This is one thing that my students time and time again are very grateful and mention that they really enjoyed. And it's actually almost, it's kind of hilarious, because if I provide them an example of a research paper that has certain headings, they'll copy those headings, right? And they'll use those headings to structure their own paper. So I'm like, why is everyone using, this particular phrase to describe this? And I'm like, oh, that's because that's what's in the example.
Provide a variety of diverse examples, or you'll get stuck with assignments that are all copies of what you gave them, in some form.
And I should say that it's not plagiarized work. It's, they're copying the structure of a paper, but to them, that gives them kind of the confidence and reassurance that they know what it is that I'm looking for in an assignment, and they know, how to structure their assignments to, to showcase that.
But letting them know there's many ways of demonstrating that learning is helpful, so that
Absolutely.
they don't all try to do it in the way that they think you want. Letting them know that you'd like to see them demonstrate it, but they're not tied to a particular way of doing it.
Absolutely. And I think also important is showing other levels of understanding. So not just the best of the best work that your students have completed in the past, but showing them what a C paper looks like and what a B paper looks like, or so forth.
And you may not want to ask students to submit their worst work. You can create some samples yourself.
Right,
and you could just say, here's some samples of work, which is B-level work. Here's a sample of something which is C-level work. And you can even have them evaluated. That's one of the things Ken Bain has done for quite a few, had done for quite a few years before he retired. He'd give students a sample of an A paper, a B paper, and a C or lower paper. And he'd ask them to work in groups and determine which ones were the A, B, and C papers and why. And then they'd use that to develop a rubric to evaluate it. And that helped students understand what constituted good writing. And it was easy for them to evaluate the work of other people than it is to evaluate their own.
Yeah. And, again, if you are teaching a course for the very first time, using your own past work or creating examples is a really good way to do that.
And there's a question in the chat: is providing an e-paper an example too strong? Not necessarily, but you probably don't want to give an example with someone's name attached, even if they gave you permission.
Yeah, it's always, I always anonymize, any student work, and make sure that there's no kind of identifying information. And I usually go several semesters back, so that those students are, but again, I get permission from those students to provide that work. The other thing I think is another, just not just providing examples of the very end product, but the, progression of that work. And so if you are scaffolding scaffolding assignments, which I think we're going to talk about here in a minute. You know, I show students work from their you know, topics to their outlines, to their annotated bibliographies, to the paper draft, to the final product. And so, you know, so that they can see, okay, so this is what that draft looked like. And then here, now I can read that final paper and see what the edits were and see what the changes were and what that comments and feedback that I had given to the student had looked like. So that way they can anticipate what that process really looks like. Providing deadlines in advance, aligning assessments and activities with objectives. So some of this, you know, you do kind of want to think about in your initial course design and utilizing that kind of backwards design to think about. But, you know, again, continuing this throughout the semester.
And reminding the students of how much their own work has progressed is really helpful in building that growth mindset, and reminding them how they struggled with certain things earlier, and then talk about how much the work has improved, at least for most students.
And I've also, in the process of scaffolding assignments, have included students creating writing goals for themselves at the beginning of the semester, and at the very end of the semester, after they've finished their final paper, they do a reflection on those goals, and they're very honest. They're like, I didn't meet this goal. I procrastinated just as much as I typically do. And, you know, they talk, you know, really about, you know, why it was the case that they achieved those goals or didn't achieve those goals. And, you know, so kind of building that into gives them an opportunity to think about their work.
And in general, we want students to be able to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. It's really helpful in building a growth mindset, and it's an important part of learning. And we don't want students to get discouraged along the way. So providing low stakes assessments where they can try things, make mistakes, and maybe either get to do them again, or at least learn from them in a way that's not going to hurt their overall performance in the course. And be explicit in that, saying, you know, this is where you're learning things in a way where it doesn't really cost you much. In my large introductory course, I say the first type of assessment they have is embedded in the readings, and they can take those as many times as they want to get a perfect score on that. The next time they're assessed on it is in class, when we're going through some examples and applications where they're using clickers, and they get some points if they're incorrect, but then they get a second chance after they've had a chance to discuss it with other people. And I also drop the 5 lowest days of scores. So, you know, I tell them the stakes are a little bit higher, but they're still pretty low. So there's not really much of a cost of making a mistake. But then they get to a weekly quiz and they have 2 attempts at that. And then, you know, so the cost of mistakes are a little bit higher. But the point is they're developing skills and improving in a way where it's not going to have much of an effect on the grade. Even a day of clicker scores is a tiny fraction of 1% of their grade, as is the case with the weekly readings and so forth and the embedded questions. But then they get to the midterm and final, which are a little bit more. They're usually like 10 or 15% of their grade. And there the stakes are a bit higher. But they've had a chance to work on things, develop skills, and they can go back and practice using those things as many times as they need with no grade penalty for them.
Yeah, I do want to just make a note here is that students, at least in my class, you know, they often, you know, they'll look at a rubric, right, and they'll look at the assignment instructions and they'll, you know, see that the assignment is 4,000 words minimum, right, and they freak out. But I remind them and, you know, clear with them over and over again that the word count is not a huge portion of their rubric grade, right? It's more about the content, their use of evidence, and supporting their claims with research. And so, you know, to really walk them through, you know, that, you know, how those grades fit in their grade calculation, and doing it over and over again is something to, you know, I think ease some anxiety around both high and lower stakes learning, because I don't think students often think about what 5% of their grade really means. You know, they, you know, might see, oh, it's a weekly quiz, and that might feel high stakes to them, but to, you know, explain to them that they can make mistakes, they should, and they should, you know, use those attempts that are allotted to improve their score. Okay, so we mentioned a little bit earlier about scaffolding high stakes assignments. So this is essentially just breaking down large assignments. Occasionally they're term projects of some type into smaller pieces that students work on throughout the semester, throughout a period of time. And incorporating in that opportunities for feedback. So at least when I've assigned a research paper that scaffolded work typically includes 6 or 7 different assignments within a final paper grade. So that includes in my class a topic submission, a annotated bibliography, an outline, a paper draft, writing goals, writing reflection, final draft, oral presentation, right? So there's 8 different pieces to that final paper grade, and that makes allows them to manage their time a little bit better, but also gives lots of opportunities for feedback along the way. And so thinking about how you structure that into all of your assignments throughout the semester is another important part.
And assigning very low weights to the early stages and allowing them in some cases to redo them as many times as needed, which can add to the workload a bit,
Sure.
but giving them that opportunity to make some mistakes, which will have a trivial effect on their overall project grade, but pointing them in a direction that would help. It gives them the sort of structure that's really necessary for all of our students to be successful.
So requiring revisions. And so there are a few easy ways that you as a professor can identify what those revisions are when you are assessing students' work. So whether you ask students to submit their revisions and track changes, that's an easy way that you can identify the changes that are made in a particular document. Google Docs has its own, suggesting, option as well. You can ask students to create a point-by-point response to revisions, similar to what we might do in a journal article. I've heard of faculty, asking students to create a summary, of the revisions that they've made. John's mentioned using plagiarism software to compare changes from a draft to a revision, another kind of easy way for a faculty member to, identify what those revisions are. But
if you submit the original copy of their draft to the plagiarism software, and when they submit the next one, it will find that much of it is plagiarized, and it will highlight the areas that are copied and the parts that are different, which makes it really easy to see where the changes have been made.
Yeah. And requiring revision is part of, the learning process, right? Giving students the opportunity to make changes based on your feedback is a really important part of, especially when we're thinking about writing assignments, it's a really important part of ensuring their understanding of the material.
There's a question: does plagiarism include reaching out to Chegg, Course Hero, and other third-party websites to make sure the assignments are not circulating? That's a topic for a different issue, but the basically Turnitin, which is what we will be getting eventually with Brightspace, sells their services to Chegg, Course Hero, and other companies to guarantee that the work that is being posted will not be detected. So basically, they're selling their services both to colleges and to the paper mills to make money on both ends of that. So we can't really count so much on plagiarism detection to detect plagiarism. And also, there are software products out there or websites out there that will rephrase your documents. And we have other workshops that we've done in the past on that quite often.
We can certainly point you to those workshops. And those instances I find are quite obvious, using thesaurus kind of software to change words because they don't always carry the same meaning that would be expected, right? So that is an important concern, something that we can definitely point you into a different direction. So another part of creating that inclusive, maintaining that inclusive classroom environment is providing ample opportunities for reflection. So thinking about, asking students how the learning objectives that you have assigned in a particular activity or assignment have been achieved, allowing them to reflect on group work.
Can I make a quick comment
Yes.
on the
Yeah.
plagiarism piece?
Mhm.
It seems when you scaffold and take a big assignment, big project, and have 8 submissions in it,
Mhm.
it's kind of hard to
Yeah.
go get it from somewhere, I think.
Yeah.
The most common problems are in multiple choice exams or short answer or essay questions when
Mhm.
people give
They
students a long
reused
period of
it.
time.
Because sometimes websites allow you, you submit the work,
Mhm.
somebody will do it, you give them $50, whatever.
Right.
But it's kind of hard to do that with the 8-part project.
With an
I
8-part
imagine.
project.
And if
Yeah.
it's done as a group project where the work is shared, it's even harder to do because the tasks of the individual students are often very focused in a way that wouldn't work very well with the plagiarism
So
software.
it plays together.
But we do have to wrap up really
Yeah.
quickly because we've already gone over by 7 minutes.
Oh,
6
boy.
minutes.
Well, so, very quickly, right? So, offering flexibility in your course, related to due dates, considering best by dates. So telling students that, their work is best by, and you will get the best feedback from the instructor by a particular date, but allowing them, to have kind of a hard deadline or a final submission date by a certain day. So I've done this in my class where that big 8-part assignment, I gave them opportunities for unlimited revisions until May 1st, right? It was a bit more work on my end, especially because most of that did come in at, the very last day of that deadline, but, it gave students this ability to revise and, they had their best by date where they would get the best feedback and they had, opportunities to revise and submit their work as many times as they'd like.
And there is a question, do you recommend percentage deduction for late submission? That's something up to the instructor.
It's up to, yeah, I typically don't, but that's just me.
I generally don't either, but in some cases I do have enforced deadlines because if some concepts are needed to move to the next stage of the course and they're participating in group activities, they have to be done with it to allow the group to proceed.
Yeah. And then our final topic, which we will wrap up here really quick,
Yes.
is engaging all students and soliciting feedback from students regularly. So including all of your students in learning activities, whether it's random assignment to small groups, asking students to rotate small group responsibilities. So identifying one student as the leader, the scribe, the reporter, and rotating those responsibilities so that we maintain equity in participation and engagement in the activity. Using polling software, as John has mentioned before, Jamboard is a really cool way to allow students to submit questions and concerns or ideas anonymously. So creating that is a very quick, easy way to encourage participation from all of your students. Soliciting feedback, whether it's via polling software, exit tickets, which we can talk about at another point. But again, I mentioned that Jamboard because you can do this at the end of class, the last 5 minutes, to say what really stood out to you in this particular course and what is still something that you need more information on, and then you can.
And it can be
start
done
the
with a
next-
Google form, or it's already built into iClicker as an option where it asks you
Oh,
if
there
you
it
want
is.
to use an exit ticket.
Yeah, so you can, then address any of those concerns, over email or at the beginning of your next class.
And just the act of having students reflect on what they don't understand is helpful for learning. There's a number of studies that have found that to be effective. And that's
that is
it. We put too much into both
had a-
this and the last session.
Yeah, we have a lot to talk about with inclusive class environment. So if you have any questions, we can take them for seconds, but I think we have to.
Well, we have like about less than a minute.
Less than
so-
a minute. You're also welcome to reach out to me or John via email.
Okay, well, thank you.